food for thought. And to segue us into our discussion, we have Liz, who's going to give us some comments.
I'll just sit after that energy. I think we need a little moment to reflect on that. So I'm going to be very brief in my comments, because if you're anything like me, you've now got lots of things that you're thinking about and you don't particularly want to hear me talking over the top of them. So I'll just, in a sense, nudge us into sharing those reflections, if I can. Firstly, by saying thank you, both of you, for really, really thought-provoking presentations there. Very different in content and nature, but speaking to a very important point for all of us is how we understand the role and the potential of education in situations of conflict and moving towards building peace. And so in a sense, it's these crucial questions that you pose us that I think are really key for us to reflect on. And for me, the ones that have stuck in my mind as you've been speaking are the questions that have informed my own research in this area over the 10, 12 years. I've been working in education situations of conflict. And for those that don't know me, by the way, sorry, my name's Liz Maber, and I'm a lecturer here on the Faculty of Education. But these questions that I keep posing to myself, and I hear in your presentations as well, of what do we mean by peace? What is this peace that we're moving towards? How does it look different? What might then be education's role in building this kind of peace that we're conceptualizing, understanding that kind of peace might be different? What do we mean by education? What is this education that we're speaking of? And might we understand it in ways that is not simply formal schooling? And another question that I was prompted to add was, how do we understand what education can do to contributing to building peace in ways that can't be measured? And moving us beyond what we can quantify into, well, how do we understand experience and difference and the really intangible dimensions that are probably the most powerful elements of experience within education. And I think in posing those questions, we're never going to have singular answers. We're always going to have really plural, diverse, different answers in different contexts and for different people. And in a sense, that's what makes this environment so difficult to work in, so challenging to work in, is precisely because there will never be singular answers to these fundamental questions. And we're always going to be seeking to understand these responses better. One thing that does strike me, though, listening to these two presentations, is that what we're seeing here is the multiple and diverse ways in which, when we prioritize, when we center the most marginalized within our communities, that's when we can understand the role of education for transformative change. And that's something that Paulo Freire has told us, and that books have told us. This is not a new idea. But if we listen to that in the context of education and conflict, and education in emergencies particularly, then we might move a bit closer to understanding what education might look like for diverse communities, and particularly for those most marginalized through conflict. And I think we see this through the innovative pedagogies that we've heard about, methods and performance to help heal trauma, when we center the experience of children in conflict and we seek to address the trauma that they've experienced in the ways that they want to express and experience those processes. Also perhaps through issues of mother tongue instruction. That might be another way that we might center different people's experiences in education, understanding that ethnic or linguistic minorities have historically been excluded from a huge number of state education sites through simply not being able to understand the medium of instruction. Particularly connecting to my work in gender inequalities and connecting gender justice to notions of peace building. How might we understand the gendered experiences in education sites, the gender violence, the gender injustice that people have experienced, men and women, young men and women have experienced in education sites, and addressing these injustices and experiences of violence might be a key dimension to understanding work moving forward as well. And finally, I would mention the contributions of feminist disability studies as well here. When we center narratives of those that live with social difference within our education systems, if we shift that dialogue away from seeing that as a deficit or a burden, then we move closer to approaching an understanding of inclusion and inclusivity that everybody benefits from, not simply those being included, but that everybody in the space benefits from this, this kind of centering of diversity. So those are my reflections, and I think I'll not go on too much more, but encourage you to share yours as well.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to just highlight which is Sustainable Peace Building and Social Justice in Times of Transition, Findings on the Role of Education in Myanmar, which is very topical.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, perhaps when you ask a question or make a comment, could you say your name and, if you would like to, something about yourself. It can be anything, but I guess people here would probably be interested in what you're working on, or something about why you're here in Cambridge. But it can be literally anything. I'll probably take 2 or 3 questions at a time. And then you guys can think about which one you want to answer and in which order, and it gives you a little bit more space to reflect. So, could I ask, please, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Or comments? Yes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Misal. I'm from Lebanon. I'm doing my MPhil in Education and Globalizations Management Development. My question to Max, actually, thank you very much for this inspiring and touching presentation. And I'm very interested in you coming back to Lebanon for a specific area that I'm currently writing my thesis on, which is on the front line between 2 different rival communities that come from 2 different religious sects, although they are both Muslim. So I think that's pretty interesting, and there's a lot of art programs going on, so I think you'd be interested in coming back to Lebanon. So my question is, what were the challenges that you encountered as, as an outsider researcher, as a white man from the West, coming to those contexts? How did you earn the trust of this community? Well, as you said, you trained the artists from the local community. How did you overcome those challenges?
Hold on to that one. Wonderful. Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth. I'm doing the same program as Rizal, and I'm researching inclusion of refugee children in formal schooling in Greece. Also a question about Max's presentation. It was really cool. I didn't know about your organization. We were wondering in our group, how do you, besides training the local artists, how do you try to make this not be a drop in the ocean? How do you bridge, like my experience, my insights is that unless you bridge to the host community, then it's very hard for any project to not be a drop in the ocean. So do you employ any strategies or techniques to reach out to the host community and really substantially bring in the host community and sort of encourage integration more?
Any question?
My name is Toshi. I've been researching conflict resolution, and then my question to this art thing is, I was quite impressed by the people from two divided societies are working on the same project, and then you presented some pictures, the people from divided communities are together, and then I'm wondering, so what brings people together through paintings?
We're going to do 3 at a time, and then we'll come back, if that's okay.
Well, those are 3 questions, each of which warrants a day's worth of conversation. I'll try to answer as articulately and succinctly as I can, going in a row. So the first is, we also had that same experience in Lebanon. We were working the huge divides between the Palestinian and Syrian and Lebanese communities. Within the Lebanese, the Christians compared to the Shia and the Sunni, there's many divides. And this actually is an answer that both with Toshi as well as your question, is that you need a reason to feel like you have something to work on together. So for example, and this goes, I think, across both of your questions, if and we found this, if you put people in a room together and just say, start talking about your issues, it doesn't really, in my experience, lead to any kind of a productive dialogue, at least in my experience. However, if you say, okay, we are here and we have a common goal, we have this huge wall and we need to paint a story, we need you to tell your story, then you have a reason to talk and to do something together. And I believe action is really important within being able to have dialogues that feel like they move, feel like something happens, right? And I know, for example, in Lebanon, when we were working in anxiety, one of the things that happened is at the end of the project, all of the girls in the community came out and started dancing. They brought music, they all started dancing. And some of the people came up to me and said, we've never seen this and we're worried what's gonna happen, that this is not necessarily allowed, right? And I said, well, this is your decision. This is your community, however you want to conduct it. He said, well, let's just see what happens. And what happened is all the families came out and they started dancing with the girls. Yeah? From both Shia and Sunni communities, from both Christian and Muslim communities, and Syrian, Palestinian, and Lebanese, all together, because these girls said, we don't care about the differences, we care about celebrating what we accomplished, because we painted this mural together. So I think that sense of accomplishment and that making of meaning is critical to feeling like you are moving the pendulum in some way, that you're doing something. So that would be my answer. To answer your question, I completely agree you have to have host communities involved. If I'm going to be completely honest with you, Greece is a very challenging context to work in compared to the others as far as sustainability. We train 10 artists from about 6 different countries to be able to learn our curriculum, to learn about pedagogy, to learn how to be able to conduct programs. And within 3 months when I came back to do our second phase, 8 of the 10 were gone. And since then, one is left. Right? The issue is a transient population. When you're working with a transient population, sustainability is very challenging, and you have to work with host communities. In Samos, where I was working, there's a lot of animosity, and the Greek artists who I met with didn't want to work with the refugees. They specifically told me, we don't want to work with them. So it's very challenging to try to broker those conversations. A success that we have had is in the Rohingya crisis, which is where we've worked with Bengali and Rohingya communities together, facilitating programs with Bengali and Rohingya children together. The real issue that we're seeing there is the unequal treatment by authority figures. Like literally to the point where we'd be entering a school and they would say, all Rohingya over here, Bengali over here, you can't be together. And how do you facilitate it where they're treated equally? And I just want to bring something up with everybody that we didn't talk about that I think everybody should consider is, and this answers I think your question as well as yours, Toshi, is there are some very deeply embedded unequal opinions about gender within a lot of these communities, right? And we're seeing, even within our own artists, where the most open-minded and the most proponent of progressive ideas of education still have been raised to believe that women are owned by men, right? Even in the most open-minded of the Rohingya community, right? So how do you battle this from the inside? And the reality is we're having to walk our artists through the idea that you have to be role models for the changing community to believe that all people are equal. Yeah. And so I think education has the capacity to do that, both from the teachers, from the children, and the communities as examples. The art's one example, but there's many others as well, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm particularly interested now in questions that are also for Kendra. But, okay.
I'm Garrett. I have a PhD in education. I work on digital technology and children's issues in the Syrian conflict. Dr. Dupuy, is that how I'm sorry,
Dupuy, it's okay. Don't, just call me Kendra. It's a lot easier.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I have 2 related questions, and I suppose I'm wondering if you might reflect a bit on how perspectives from critical literature on development studies and education and humanitarianism map onto some of the literature that you've reviewed. So first I'm thinking about the critique of the World Bank as an institution with a predominantly neoliberal worldview. A paradigm that often tries to locate development issues at the individual level. And when you were reviewing some of the key themes and relationships that you found in the literature, it seemed like a lot of them were about, in terms of grievances, opportunity costs, there were questions about why or why not individuals would be violent, which presupposes that these conflicts, interstate conflicts, are about people being violent rather than violence happening to them. And I think statistically, a lot of recent interstate conflict shows that for the most part, most people are passive to violence, they're not actually perpetuators of violence. So that's one. And the other is, how would this change if we shifted the focus to interstate conflict, and how do we make sense of this finding that there's a correlation between kind of passivity to violence and education if we account for the fact that it's been the most highly educated and economically developed countries in the world that have perpetuated some of the greatest and darkest instances of conflict in the past 50 years. So, yeah.
Can I just build on his question?
Can you do
Build on his
yes?
answer with another question. So, given the example of Syria, Syria was always well known to have the most rigorous, really very rigorous education system. Syrian people were among the most educated in the Middle East. We achieved near universal primary enrollment. Our rates of completing secondary school is really high. Our higher education is for free. But still, when a decision of war was taken at the national, regional, and global level, all educated people in Syria, we found ourselves like helpless in the face of this complex structural reality. So my question is, when we look at all research that look at the relationship between education and conflict, we always look at internal affairs, we look at what's happening within the context, the conflicted context. So my question is, given that even with the most localized wars, there is a myriad of transnational connections, to what extent do you think there is really a need to reorient the efforts of these research towards a kind of like more decolonial approach of looking at this relationship? So to myself, I think like sometimes it's worth it to look at what's happening in the content of education in other countries that exist at the other end of the spectrum. For example, the global countries that interfere in other countries and cause most of these. So it's sort of open to what we said.
Okay. So something I know is of great interest here in the faculty at the moment is the decolonising agenda. And so is there anybody that's got a question that might relate to either of the speakers around
Yes, yeah. It connects to what you were speaking to about the question of what quality education is, Kendra, and often the sort of bus and seats approach. Most of these are the locations that Max presented for our former colonial states, and quite often the formal educational system is quite rote and has all these sort of post-colonial vestiges of education systems that are not even practiced in those colonial states any longer. So what I found very powerful about Max's work was how embodied it was, and what sort of, as we're defining what educational quality looks like in incredibly diverse settings, what role there may be for embodied learning, whether it's performing art or physical performing arts, or even the physical activity of making a mural, which is a tremendously physically challenging activity, whether there's room for embodied learning as a decolonial learning practice.
Okay, those were 3 easy questions. Because I have to earn my pay at the end of the day as a researcher. So let me take the last one first, and maybe you can comment on this.
Sure.
So I've done some work on life skills education, and there's a lot of, that's a really interesting field, again, kind of understudied. But there's a lot of evidence to show that life skills means anything and everything. So again, a poorly defined concept, but there's a lot to suggest that life skills education leads to really positive outcomes in participants' lives, and also life skills delivered in conflict or crisis settings. And we see a lot of NGOs, and they're sitting right here, now delivering, understanding that education is not just about sitting in classrooms, that it necessarily has to involve after-school activities, it has to involve communities, parents, I mean, it has to be much more holistic, I think, than the approach before. It is often still rote learning, and there is still this problem of, not a problem, but the challenge of we need to make sure we can achieve the right to education in these contexts, but we also need to try to get a quality education, right? And with limited resources. So do you want to say anything about embodied learning? I feel like that's your department.
I would love to, and I love what you just said, actually, because I think the reality is, for many of the issues, right, that many people think aren't necessarily connected to education, infant mortality rates, issues about public health, mental health, issues about domestic violence, there's the myriad of issues that exists. I truly believe that education is the key to discussing all of those issues. The issue is when you keep it just in the classroom, you're not impacting the families. And probably some of the most impactful firsthand experiences I have had is watching the parents watch their children and then get involved with their children. In most of these environments that we're working, the idea of parents and children working on equal ground, I don't think is normalized or exists. And I think when you're talking about the bigger issues, and I loved your question, I thought it was really important as far as kind of these people who are subject to violence rather than perpetrators of violence. The issue is that I think in many of these cases you're dealing with the idea that you're trying to treat trauma. Everybody's traumatized. Everybody has PTSD. You know, so I believe, and I was recently, actually a little while ago, was speaking at a conference by the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies about how psychosocial support and social and emotional learning need to be integrated into all elements of education and crisis conflicts, not as an add-on, but it needs to be embedded within. And I think when you're talking about embodied learning,
much more holistic,
Do you mind if I chip in there as well?
Please.
To just add to that, that it's in the non-formal sector that we see this happening.
Yeah.
And if we just let go of the idea of education as formal schooling, and we understand the learning practices that we see all around the world in lots of contexts in these non-formal environments, we can see it going on. And you learn there what are the priorities for communities. In contexts I've worked in, it's often sexuality education, so again, coming back to really embodied experiences for young women and also young men, and learning about their body. And these things are happening, and we can learn from them to see exactly what these priorities are and how we might approach them in different ways.
Yeah. Okay, let me answer the last two questions, I think, together. And the answer I'm going to give a little bit longer answer, but the punchline is going to be that we need to do more and look more at the qualitative literature, because that's where a lot of these interesting insights are coming from. Including, I'm going to make that a broad umbrella and include critical literature in there. So let me give just a little bit more text to this. So let me back up and say that these quantitative studies, so what they're saying, it's not deterministic. It's not that countries or places with lower education are going to experience armed conflict. It is just that on average, we think that they have a higher likelihood. So it's not deterministic, okay? Now, second of all, the comment about this focus on the individual, that's a very nice observation. So within conflict studies, there is, and you're very right, there's been this focus on individuals. Why do some individuals choose to join violence? Without also recognizing, as both of you pointed out, that, and the qualitative literature nicely points out, that people have very few choices in these settings, that they're often forced to, for whatever reason, that they need to eat, that they can't, there is no option. And that we really do know from various studies, actually from the Greek and the Spanish civil wars, so long back in history, also more current civil wars like in Sierra Leone and West Africa. So we, I think we need to look much more at, and going back to my research agenda, survey the qualitative literature, really bring together these insights more systematically to really understand to what degree people have this kind of individual agency and to maybe push back against that. One of you said, well, maybe both of you at the end of the day, kind of going back to this reflection that, yes, actually educated people do participate in, or don't at least push back against conflict, right? That educated populations in the US or wherever are not actively pushing back against conflict in other states, or that, yes, you're absolutely right, World War II. I mean, this is a big, maybe sort of elephant in that room that we don't often acknowledge, but you're absolutely right, that highly educated, rich countries went to war and education didn't stop them. There is some interesting literature about Nazi Germany, for instance, and what is going on in the education systems at that time that would be interesting to look back on and bring in as lessons for today, perhaps. So, thanks for those questions. They were super interesting.
Okay, thank you. So, we've probably got time for one more round of questions. If you're burning to ask a question, please just raise your hand so I can see how many of you there are. I know Hoga had one.
A lot of it was answered just now.
Okay. Are there any other questions? One here?
There's one.
One here?
It's not burning.
Yeah. Okay. about the use of pictures and images. Another thing that we are reflecting on here in the faculty, and a kind of commodification of children's images and poverty through NGOs, and how you manage the ethical dilemmas of the way that children are represented through pictures. So can I then go to, let's just take all of them and then you can choose which one to answer.
So really quickly, just who are these theories, the generalized theories that come, sorry for Dr. Kendra.
Yeah.
Who are these generalized theories for that come from these quantitative studies, such as the one about rapid expansion of education can negatively impact, could be negative, when a lot of states in the global south can use them to exclude a whole generation of people, especially in the rural sides, because of theories like that.
Yeah, so I actually read your paper before I
Oh, wow, A for you.
did my exam prep for business. But when I read the paper, I really appreciated how critical you were and your colleagues in your writing about these things. But I felt like maybe we're asking the wrong questions. I felt like when we ask questions about how formal schooling contributes or doesn't contribute to peace and conflict, we perpetuate a narrative that's very much Western and very much oriented towards a kind of linear idea of development. So we're integrating conflict in this narrative that we have about the world and about the social order, but it doesn't make, this narrative is not in any way universal. So I'm wondering if we maybe asked the wrong questions. And then secondly, kind of for both of you, I think what came across was a lot of burden on education. Both your perspectives put a lot of burden on education, but we also know that education is reproductive in many ways and reproduces other things in society that were not addressed. And we know that Galton thinks that positive peace is about addressing the roots of conflict, and I don't think we speak enough about the roots of conflict as opposed to the effects of conflict and how we can address the effects. So this is more a rant than a question. But yeah, I was just, thank you for your presentation on this edition.
Yeah, I guess my question kind of adds on to that one. I think something that struck me in the presentation was the idea of allyship and understanding, becoming aware of the space you take up, especially with the young boy, recognising that even though there are similarities in in pain and suffering, rather than playing a blame game, it's saying, right, okay, we're both facing a situation, but what can I do with any kind of limited, not privilege, but maybe kind of resources, I guess, that are available to you in this situation, but not me in this situation, you know what I mean? In the kind of, in that sense, of looking at things, I guess, intersection with the idea of disability and justice as well. I'm just kind of thinking that maybe it's through the art program, once you kind of draw similarities and, teach people that they're facing the same things, is anything then kind of done to say, we're facing the same things but potentially in different situations, I guess? So if you have kind of with the other structural privilege as well, and is anything then kind of done in, right, we're friends now, we're in the same boat, I understand your struggle, what can I do to help you, what can you do to help me, in a kind of structural sense, I guess, in terms of looking at it both as an individual, but also, I guess, that kind of report.
Yes.
Just pop that out there. You don't have to answer representative questions, but I think it's important. So I'm interested, it's directed to Max or anyone, I'm interested what evidence is there about what is distinctive about the arts practice and programs that makes them so well suited for well-being and peace educations.
Okay. Are there any more questions or comments? Because I'm going to close in a second. Anybody got one they're desperate to say? Yes.
I'm not desperate, but
okay.
I'm doing to join the Galton fan club that we're all part of now. Doing some research into reclassifying the disadvantage that Gypsy Roma traveller children face in the UK to direct structural and cultural violence. And I wondered, for the whole panel, what space you thought there was for understanding peace education in a sort of pre-conflict environment. Like we're not talking about armed conflict. This is a conflict that exists, but that could exist in the future. Obviously, you can't say that you know it will, but yes, definitely,
yeah. Okay, wonderful. And
there's another question.
Okay, yes, please.
I mean, thank you, Max. I think everybody was amazing. I really like when you said that, like, you have, it's not just like that community, but you bring like some images and some experiences from other communities and refugee camps that you've been to, and the kids from different refugee camps to get to know about each other. And it's quite really powerful that, like you said, that how like art brings people together and kids together, and they started creating these things like collectively. Like, well, my question is that, like, I mean, we also are seeing this in the countries that we call it first world countries, where we have technology and all that. Kids growing up with the internet, they don't understand what borders are, what gender and what races are. But my question is that, have you ever had the chance to go back to your community and see what changes, like the murals that you and Artolution left there? Because it's, to me, it seems like it's like a portal that you're creating, and then the effects of that portal and effects, and see how like kids have changed over a year or two.
Okay, so I'm now having an impossible task as a chair, because we are technically out of time. I think rather than ask you to respond directly to all of those questions, I think it's incredibly valuable to have the questions out. We can all reflect on what our personal responses might be to those questions. I'll perhaps ask each of you just to say one or two sentences in summary, and then of course, if people would like to, they can hang around and continue to have conversations. I have no idea if we're going to have people coming in for tea or something in 2 minutes, for example. So I'm going to try and finish as close to on time as possible. But so could I ask you for a concluding comment?
Well, I'll start from a research environment, since I'm sitting at Cambridge University. I feel like this is the people to speak to, so I'm just going to repeat my plea that we need more research on education in conflict and crisis situations. I've provided some things that I think are interesting questions, but I mean, big brains sitting in the room, many of them. So I think I would just end with a plea to keep on keeping on in that. There we go.
Okay, one sentence. 2 sentences. Okay. Here's what I'm going to say. Is there evidence? Right? The answer.
Oh. You don't have to go into.
Right. I'm not going to, but I want to know too. Right? And I'm finishing my dissertation, and I highly recommend everyone to read a book called Art Making with Refugees and Survivors that I recently published a chapter in that answers that question. And I think the final note to try to answer, just in my opinion, I think there need to be new solutions to the history of how we are talking about crisis. I think the question to ask is, here's the question. What is our role to play in the wars to come? I believe that there will be more wars, there will be more trauma, and that this will not stop. Yeah? What are we doing to try to preempt and to heal and repair this trauma through research, through education, and how can we make the biggest difference in the ways that we can every day? That would be what I would say.
I'm loath to add a comment after that. I would say I'm delighted and encouraged by the wonderful students in this room that have such brilliant insights and questions, and especially those that are graduating very shortly and are going out into the world with these questions. I feel encouraged that you're taking these questions with you. It makes me more hopeful about the future. And in general, I think it gives me some comfort that, again, we're questioning what we mean by education. We're questioning what we mean by peace and what we mean by conflict and how we understand violence. And pluralizing this field, I think, is incredibly important and is encouraging to see, at least, as a small step forward.
So can I ask, please, that we all show our appreciation